This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live.
Today on Saturday Morning Breakfast Show, we are talking the effect of prior knowledge. What exactly does it mean when our students come into the classroom with knowledge of our subject already? How do we make the most of that, and what pitfalls are there to students thinking that they know it all before they even step into the room?
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and you are listening live. Tune in live at ttradio.org, or to join in the conversation, download the Podbean app and search Teachers Talk Radio. Follow the hashtag TTRadio. Tune in, talk it out with Teachers Talk Radio.
Well, the goodest of good mornings to you. It is today, Saturday the 17th of August 2024. It is a bright and sunny day here in Gloucestershire. We are kind of the dog days of summer, I think it's called, isn't it? That's where we are now, as summer kind of goes out of the window. That was me dropping my headphones, just in case the microphone picked that up. Summer is kind of on its way out, and we are headed into what you all know is my favourite time of year, the autumn-winter season. I can't believe, though, how quickly 2024 has gone. I actually can't believe that we are mid-August, coming to the end of August, depending on how you want to see it. I know that the idea of coming to the end of August can be quite depressing, because that does mean that back to work is on the horizon for many of us. But yeah, I can't, after the past couple of years where I've talked about how slowly the year has gone, I must say I felt that the 2023-2024 academic year went incredibly slowly. But that is probably because it was actually quite a stressful year for me and for many of my colleagues, and that can alter our perception of time. I can't believe how quickly the calendar year of 2024 has gone. And that I find quite interesting, the fact that two things can be true. That, 2023-2024, the academic year, can have gone very slowly, despite the fact that 7 months of it were in the calendar year 2024, which has gone by very, very quickly. But yeah, we are now on to the kind of part of summer that I actually reluctantly do quite like. Kind of as it cools down, although from what I've heard, the UK has not had a particularly hot summer, although I must say it's been quite warm since I got back, so I'm not sure that I believe all of these stories about wet and windy. But yeah, as it begins to cool down and it's quite nice and you can open the windows and let the air through without being blasted with heat, yeah, it's quite good. It's quite good. But of course, that's probably just because I'm in a good mood, because I know that autumn is just around the corner. We've got quite a good show. I think we've got a good show. Mind you, I always think that I have at least an interesting show, if not a good one, for you, because if I didn't think a topic was interesting, I wouldn't talk about it, quite honestly. I've got what I think is quite an interesting show for you today about prior knowledge, because that's something that gets bandied around as something that we take for granted. It's a concept that we all know about. We learn about it in our initial teacher training, but we don't talk about it very often. We don't actually think about it very often. And for me, one of the big things that I'm taking away from my doctoral study is how much we take for granted, and the fact that we actually shouldn't take any of our pedagogy for granted, even things that might seem like common sense. Students come into a lesson with prior knowledge and therefore we should build on that. It does still need to be unpacked, because unless we can justify a practice, there's not really a whole lot of point in having it, in my opinion. And I think sometimes we can get into a bit of a rut, I suppose, where we don't think about our practice and we just kind of do what we have always done. So, as much as anything, this is for me as a reminder of why prior knowledge is important. This is also quite interesting for me because, as I've mentioned on the show before, I don't think it was last week, I think it was my last show before I went away, I'm actually taking on a new role this academic year, which I have already started. I'm a head of department for the first time. And I have realized that a lot of my students coming in and taking my courses actually don't have prior knowledge of the languages that they're studying. A lot of them are coming in ab initio. And so that's been quite interesting to go from a point where for the last 12 years, when my students have come to me, they have always had prior knowledge. You know, my year threes will come in having done French from reception, most of them. My year sevens would come in, again, most of them having done at least some French at primary school. The year 10s would come in having done at least some French through Key Stage 3. The year 12s would come in, of course, with a GCSE in French, because it makes no sense to start A level if you don't have a GCSE. And so it's been quite a long time since I've actually taught ab initio students. And when I did that, it was way back at the start of my career when I was a primary MFL specialist. And so my ab initio students were all in reception. So it's been a long time since I've taught older students who are coming into a language completely from scratch. So that's been quite interesting. And again, one of the reasons that I've chosen the topic for the show today is to kind of help me. And I hope it helps you too. As always, if you want to engage with the show today, you can. If you are listening live through the Podbean app, you can text me. Your texts come up on my little screen here and I read them out. If you want to text me but you don't want me to read your text out, that's fine. Just let me know before and I won't. But I will always happily read your texts out and kind of engage with you here on air. If you are listening live elsewhere, you can always tweet me. I am at Mr. D Lester. That's MIDLESTER, and that is all one word. And I've got Twitter open in another window here, so I will read your tweets out and we can engage that way. If you are listening back, if you are not live, if it is no longer 9:09 on Saturday the 17th of August 2024 for you, you can still tweet me because, as I always say, to the extent that I feel like I should record this as a bit of a soundbite, I always pick topics that I feel I will be perennially interested in. So if you are listening back, you are just discovering this show, talking about the effect of prior knowledge, and you want to chat to me about it, and it's far in the future, please do. Please do, because as long as I'm still around, I will still be interested. I also would just like to do a quick shout out, a quick hello to anybody who is listening because they got their A-level results and they are about to start their teacher training career. Anybody who is going straight from the sixth form into maybe a B.Ed or a B.A. with an educational specialism, hello to you. And to anybody who maybe has just got their initial degree results and have found that that's got them onto their PGCE or any other teacher training program, congratulations and hello to you too. Here on Saturday Morning Breakfast, I like to talk about pedagogy quite a lot. I don't remember who it was, but I saw a tweet once about 18 months ago from one of my fellow hosts, and I'm really sorry that I don't remember who it was. But they said that doing Teacher Talk Radio was the best CPD they had ever done. Because, of course, when we prep for these shows, we have to do all of the reading. We've got to set the time aside. And that is absolutely true. Being here with you on a Saturday morning is the best CPD that I have ever had in my, we're going into 18 years of teaching. And I like to share what I have learned with you. I am one of those geeky teachers that likes pedagogy. I like to know the theory. I like to talk about the theory, and that's why I'm here. So, if you are about to go into your teacher training and you are here because you wanted to check out Teachers Talk Radio, because you wanted to kind of see what the career that you are about to embark on is all about, welcome. And do keep joining in to Saturday morning breakfast, because we talk a lot about what it is to be a teacher, about the science that underpins our profession.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping by to tell you about our annual history teaching extravaganza, Teachers Talk History, which is coming at you live in Manchester on the 21st of September. The tickets are completely free for classroom teachers, amazing speakers, brilliant contributors, and a fantastic opportunity to network with fellow professionals. Grab your free ticket today at ttradio.org/events, and we will see you there.
This is Teachers Talk Radio, and this is Teachers Talk Radio News.
This is your Teachers Talk Radio News for the week ending the 16th of August. This week, the news has been dominated by exam results, and the newspapers highlight a number of interesting features. The Independent, along with many other newspapers, including The Times and The Guardian, and the BBC of course, celebrate the fact that grades were up, at least the higher grades, with 27.8% of students across the UK achieving A star or A grades. This was a return, and indeed an improvement on, levels which existed before the pandemic. However, this was a significant reduction overall on the grades achieved by students during the pandemic. The Guardian Education, again along with other newspapers, pointed out that the education gap of attainment widened, depending on where you lived in England. In the south of England, top grades, A star to A, were achieved by 30% of students, whereas in the West Midlands, the Isle of Wight, and Wales, it was 24%. Nick Harrison, Chief Executive of the Sutton Trust, said there are stubbornly wide gaps which remain. And Lee Elliott Major, Professor of Social Mobility, pointed to stark divides. And overall, it continues to be the case that there is enormous class advantage, with students from disadvantaged homes doing significantly worse. Another angle on the exam results was also the difference between the success rate in different subjects. Students were far more likely to achieve A star and A grades in mathematics, further mathematics, and computer science than they were in sociology and the classics. However, if the Evening Standard is to be believed, employers are increasingly disregarding degrees. from their applicants. The percentage of job applications not requiring a degree was up by over 14% since 2021. This was found in data from LinkedIn, and companies, it said, are putting more emphasis on soft skills such as collaboration and adaptability. The research website TeacherTapp tried to answer that perennial question, what are schools for? And identified from the results of its surveys 7 key objectives ranked in order. The main purpose of schools, according to the majority of teachers who filled in the survey, was to provide basic skills like numeracy and literacy. Second was to develop independence. Third, help students form good relationships. Fourth, prepare students for the world of work. 5, give children an enjoyable childhood. 6, to help them pass exams. And finally, number 7, to provide childcare so that parents could work. Returning to the theme of exams, The Guardian and other newspapers reported that students are choosing a narrower range of subjects at A-level. Since the Gove reforms and the removal of subjects like communication studies, general studies, critical thinking, and the increase in exams rather than coursework, students have focused on the STEM subjects, science, maths and technology, with a continuing decline in art and English literature, as well as the social sciences. A number of newspapers have observed that this is rather out of sync with trends in the economy, since the arts and social services are such an enormous part of the UK economy. The decline in students taking social sciences and arts subjects, as well as literature, may prove to be a headache for some university departments, but generally speaking, universities are in trouble, as is highlighted by a number of newspapers and Sky News, stating that students aren't the only ones feeling anxious on results day, as a crisis overtakes many British universities. Years of underfunding have profoundly weakened the finances of the higher education sector. Also, a precipitous decline in the number of students coming from abroad, whose fees are considerably higher and have been a cornerstone of the financial plans of many British universities. And finally, encouraging news for forest schools and all schools that still maintain a nature table in the classroom. Schools Week carries the story of schools which prioritise sustainability, which has improved behaviour as well as well-being in the school. The 2023 Pearson School Report revealed that 6 in 10 teachers feel they have a powerful role to play in shaping sustainability-minded citizens. One school, which has an allotment for growing vegetables, chickens and goats and rabbits, where children have learned where their food comes from and the carbon footprint involved in food production, saw improved behaviour across the school, as well as, reported by the staff, a general sense of well-being and happiness. This has been your Teachers Talk Radio News with John Gibbs.
I think it's quite sad listening to those reasons for school that John was talking about, those 7 reasons that came up from that with the TeacherTapp survey. I think it's really sad that childcare and that preparing for the world of work came ahead of because my subject is really interesting and I think it's good to learn about. Now, I'm not saying that those reasons for schooling are wrong. I'm not saying even that our priorities are askew. And I'm not saying that, interest in a subject was not on the list at all. And, maybe John reeled off the 7 of the top 10 and it was number 8. I just think it's sad that in schools we don't promote learning for the enjoyment of learning. I think it's sad that we don't see as a priority the idea that we should encourage a love of learning in our children. Because I've found as adults, we tend to want to come back to learning. We tend to rediscover our love of learning. The number of times I've sat in a parents' evening and I've had parents say to me, "Oh, I wish I'd carried on with French at school. But I didn't because of X, Y, and Z. And, but I'm doing Duolingo." Other language learning apps are available. Or, the number of times I've had adult students sign up for one of my courses. And, when I've asked them why, for a few of them, it's a career change and they need an extra GCSE. But for a few of them, it's, I really want to learn. I really appreciate the fact that we have these opportunities to learn now. I do think that there is an innate human interest in learning. And I do think that children want to learn, so long as we present it in a way that is interesting, that is accessible, that does foster that does encourage that. But I think it's sad that we don't prioritize the idea of learning for the sake of learning. That we don't prioritize the fact that it is interesting to broaden your horizons. It is interesting to learn how other countries function. It's interesting to know how, why flowers flower in the way that they do. Can I move my clock? It's quite distracting. I'm not actually sure that I can, because I am not in my regular studio. So I do apologize for the distraction. I thought that I had turned my sound dampening off, but I probably hadn't. I will be back to my clockless studio next week, but I am elsewhere today. So yeah, I think that it is a bit sad. I think it's sad that we don't prioritize learning for the sake of learning. But let's talk about prior knowledge, because that is what I am here to talk about today. Now, as a language teacher, I have quite an interesting relationship with prior knowledge, because it comes in two forms for me. I either get students who invariably come in with kind of no prior knowledge whatsoever, and that's absolutely fair. Or I have students who come in and say to me, "Oh yes, Mr. Lester, I speak Japanese," and then they reel off some words that they learned from anime, which, perfectly legitimate Japanese, but are not words that you would use in a conversation, and kind of together don't make a whole lot of sense, and make them sound quite often like old-fashioned samurai. So prior knowledge is an interesting one, I think. Now, I've shared before about the social constructivist viewpoint in which I was trained. I did a whole show on that previously. So if you haven't listened to that one, please do go back and check it out. But from a social constructivist point of view, knowledge is constructed. Knowledge is created from how we engage with our environment. And so there is no such child who is a blank slate. Children are always going to come into our classrooms with something that they know about our subject. For languages, for example, they will at least come in knowing that French is a language. They may have heard some French spoken on TV. They will be aware of different countries from the football, and so even if they are not quite sure what language they speak in Germany, when I mention Germany, they will be able to reel me off some players, etc. There will always be something. There will always be something that they know. And that fits in, I think, with what Jonassen and Gabrowski said in 1993 when they defined prior knowledge as the knowledge, skills, or ability that a student brings to the learning process. Now, it might seem a bit redundant to define prior knowledge, but actually I think it's really important because we can sometimes get a bit lost in what prior knowledge actually means. We can get a bit caught up in, for me, how fluent are they when they come in? If I've got, for example, a student in my A-level Chinese class who is from Beijing, chances are they're already going to speak Chinese quite well. And so, there is that. Prior knowledge can, in our head, be, do they already know what I'm trying to teach them? But prior knowledge can also be, do they know other things about the topic that I'm not actually going to teach, but could inform the learning at large? So, for example, when I learnt Mandarin, I went into my first lesson already fluent in Japanese, which meant that I already knew the basics of reading and writing the hanzi, the symbols. And so that kind of gave me a springboard. It didn't give me everything that I needed, but it did make my learning journey that little bit easier. It can also, though, be about misconceptions, because children may have learnt something that was wrong, not because they were taught it incorrectly, not because the teacher didn't know what they were talking about, but just because they misheard, or because they had internalized the wrong idea. So I've mentioned before the student who, back when I was a primary teacher, I was doing a cover lesson once on states of matter. And I had a student who was absolutely convinced that pencils were a liquid. And I asked her why, and she could explain to me. She knew that liquids took the shape of a container when they went into it. And she knew that if she picked up a bunch of pencils and she put them into a circular container, they would create a circle shape. So in her head, pencils were a liquid. So she had learnt correctly that that different states of matter have different forms, but she had incorrectly learnt what a pencil was. And I remember blowing her mind when I took one pencil and I dropped it in the sink in the classroom and it stayed in the shape of a pencil. That's one of those teaching moments that will stay with me forever. So sometimes prior knowledge is incorrect knowledge. Sometimes prior knowledge is students coming into my Japanese lesson telling me that they speak the language and they sound like a 14th century feudal lord. Again, not a bad thing, because they are showing me that they have interest in the topic. They are showing me that they are exploring the topic outside of the classroom, but I may have to reteach them a few things to update their vocabulary. Prior knowledge, though, is one of the most influential factors in learning. Ausubel wrote all about this in 1968, so this is not a new concept by any means. And the reason for this is that, as I said before, if we're taking a social constructivist point of view, prior knowledge builds on, knowledge creation in general builds on what has come before. So in history, for example, in Key Stage 1, I don't know if this is still the case, but it was back in the day when I was teaching primary. Key Stage 1 was when they learnt about sequential time, and they learnt this concept of one time period comes after another, and then the next one comes after that. That then is built up as they go through their historical curricula, because they then begin to piece together on the timeline of history where each period came and how one period built on the last. So, big shout out right now to my primary colleagues who do an amazing job in giving such a broad curriculum on which secondary colleagues can build as they move up as the students move up through the schooling. But they often struggle to make connections between prior and current knowledge. Again, I remember this from back in my primary days. I remember teaching a year 6 lesson, and I was recapping something that I'd done with them in year 5. We were taught, days of the week. I taught them days of the week in year 5, which they had also done in year 2. And then in year 6, I came back to it because I knew the reading comprehension that I was going to get them to do had the days of the weekend. And I started my lesson with, okay, we're going to go back through the days of the week. I hope you remember these because we did them in year 5. And one of my pupils, very, very able young man, top of the class in most subjects, said to me, wait, you expect us to remember what we did last year? And it took me a moment to figure out how to respond to that, because it hadn't occurred to him that school was sequential. It hadn't occurred to him that each new year group, each new school year was kind of like a reset, and he was able to just kind of move on and start again. And so I think sometimes we've got to make it very explicit to our students that we do expect them to remember, and we expect them not just to remember, but to build on what they already know. We also need to make explicit these connections, because we might think things are obvious, but they might not. And this is why elicitation is really important. Now, when I trained, we were taught to do elicitation at the beginning of each new topic. So the idea behind elicitation is that you find out what the pupils already know. We were trained to do that at the beginning of each new topic, kind of so that we didn't teach something that the whole class already had a decent grasp on. However, the main reason that we do elicitation, in my opinion, is so that we can prompt children to recall what they already know. Because if the knowledge has made that transfer from long to short-term memory, they might not know that they know it. And if they don't know that they know it, then they're not going to know to make connections between it and the old, or between it and the new knowledge. So doing an elicitation activity, or doing a daily, weekly, monthly review per Rosenshine, will help your students to recall what they already know, which will help them to make connections between previous learning and new learning, which in turn will help them to hang the new learning on something. It's really hard just to remember something new. It's really hard just to have a new fact in your head. However, if you are able to attach that to a fact you already know, if you are able to hang that off of something that you already have, then you are more likely to remember it. So prior knowledge is really helpful. Eliciting prior knowledge is really helpful in terms of bringing the new knowledge into the fore, helping our students to remember what is coming. Now, this isn't new to us, okay, as teachers, as adults, because I know that not everybody who tunes in to Saturday Morning Breakfast is a teacher. But while most of us are aware that new learning kind of refines that prior knowledge, we make it more complex. So, we go from teaching 3 states of matter in Key Stage 2 up to learning about 4 states of matter, that introduction of plasma in Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. I'm not a secondary science teacher, so I don't know, but I know that plasma makes an appearance somewhere. We refine that knowledge. We make it more complex. We make it more nuanced as our children are better able to handle it. But from a science of learning perspective, prior knowledge is central to organizing and reassembling new information to make it meaningful. Now, this all happens in the prefrontal region of the brain, and that's the area of a child's brain that is very typically slow to develop. So this idea of reassembling knowledge, of assembling knowledge, of creating knowledge and having it be meaningful, that is something that children don't develop very quickly. Okay, it takes time. And this is why, as we said a couple of minutes ago, this is why even though children may possess prior knowledge, they might not make the connection between it and the new content. And so this is why it's important to remind them, to prompt them of what they already know. Think about children's book series, for example. Anything with 3 or 4 books that has a kind of sequential plot. Quite often, there will be ways for characters in book 2 to recap what happened in book 1, or for characters in book 3 to recap what happened in book 2. And this is that same idea. It's because what's happening in the next book relies on something that happened in the first book, and so the children need to be reminded of that. Quite often we say, it's because children forget, because their long-term memory isn't as developed. And yes, that's absolutely true, because this prefrontal region of their brain isn't fully developed yet. So again, don't just know that there is prior knowledge. Don't just write on your lesson plan or your curriculum overview that children already have this prior knowledge. Activate it. And don't do like I did on my training and get quite frustrated that they didn't remember from year on year. Recognize that it's not their fault. It is part of their development that they don't know. They don't always retain things, and they don't always make their connections. So we increase the likelihood that our students will remember and use what we teach them by helping them to engage their prior knowledge and connect new information to information that they had before. When I teach days of the week in German, for example, I can use the days of the week in English to create those hooks. So when I teach my days of the week in German, I always do a bit of an etymology lesson on the days of the week in English. So we talk about how Monday is Moon Day, which has been contracted, and then it's Montag in German. So they can hang that. They can hang Montag onto Monday, and then they can make that connection about the moon. We do it all the time in languages when we talk about cognates. You can remember what le café is because English stole it from French. We borrowed it from the French language. My Japanese students know what karaoke is because they've done karaoke. So there are always these things, these experiences, this knowledge that you can hang this information from. Now, in the classroom, the extent to which children engage their prior knowledge is massively variable. Some children need lots of support to recall and apply stuff that they have already done before. And this is generally not down to academic attainment. So you're not saying, my lower attaining students need more help activating their prior knowledge. Because like I said before, my student who whose mind was blown by the fact that he had to remember stuff from year 5 when he was in year 6. He was one of our top attaining students. Okay, so it's not your usual differentiation. You need to think about each student in turn and how well they've shown you that they can engage with their own prior learning. It is also important to think about the quality of the prior learning. Again, has a student learned a misconception? Because if they have, of course, then that means that their prior knowledge is faulty. So that's more difficult to hang something off of. So you may have to correct those misconceptions before you can move on. And that's why correcting the misconceptions is important. It's not just about making sure they get things right. Because as you know, in my opinion, learning is not about exam results and all that jazz. It's about the joy of that discovery. But we correct these prior misconceptions so that our students can understand what's coming next, to make it easier for them to learn what's coming next. But that does make it quite difficult, because some students will come with more prior learning than others. And this is down to cultural capital. This is down to what children do in their own lives outside of school. So, children who regularly go to museums might have a better grasp of historical chronology than children who don't. Children who regularly go to the cinema might better understand how scenes in films are cut together because they've seen it more often than children who don't. So cultural capital is a big one. But what children have been exposed to in school is also really important. I think I've told this story on the show before. When I'm drawing lots on my time as a primary school teacher today, but when I was a primary MFL specialist, I remember being visited once by one of my previous year's year 6s. He'd come to pick up his sister, just gone into year 7 and come to pick up his sister. So we stopped him, very excited to tell me all about his French lessons. And, he was telling me about how impressed his teacher was that he knew the phrase mot du jour, word of the day. But that was because that was something that I did in my classroom. We had each class had their own mot du jour, which I gave to the class teacher every day for them to just have up on the board. And he'd internalized that, he'd remembered that. And he was really excited that his new French teacher was excited that he knew that phrase. And so I asked him, are you enjoying French? Are you learning lots of new stuff? And his face fell. And he kind of said to me, well, no, we're doing things that we did in reception. And, they had gone back to numbers 1 to 10. They had gone back to days of the week. They had gone back to animals. And I know exactly why the teacher did that. And it would have been because there were children in that class who had not done French before. Maybe they had done Spanish in their primary school. Maybe they had done Chinese in their primary school. There would be children in that class who had French once a week, but when it came to SATs time, that was the first thing that was pushed out so that they could do revision for their SATs. There would be children who did French once every 3 or 4 weeks when the teacher could fit it in. When you have your class, they come with a whole different range, a wide range of different educational experiences. And that can be very difficult to plan for. So the quality of prior knowledge, the amount of prior knowledge, has so many different variables that it is almost impossible to plan for it without doing an elicitation exercise. And that does then become another area of differentiation. These students already know this, but these students in that same class don't. And so that creates this pedagogical challenge for a teacher. We've got to make sure that every child is engaged in reactivating their prior knowledge, but we also have to assess the quality of that prior understanding.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping by to tell you about our annual history teaching extravaganza, Teachers Talk History, which is coming at you live in Manchester on the 21st of September. The tickets are completely free for classroom teachers, amazing speakers, brilliant contributors, and a fantastic opportunity to network with fellow professionals. Grab your free ticket today at ttradio.org/events, and we will see you there.
Let's also be very honest. Assessing the quality of prior knowledge is what exams do. Exams expect our students to be able to take what they have learnt and apply it in this very specific situation. It's an application of knowledge test. And so by the time they go to sit their exam, whatever exam that might be, their SATs, their GCSEs, their A-levels, their finals at university, what is being assessed is prior knowledge. It's no longer stuff that they have learned in the 30 minutes preceding the exam. It's what they have learnt in all of their schooling up until that point, or all of their course up until that point. I suppose the moment you stop learning anything, the moment you walk out of a classroom, the learning that took place becomes prior knowledge. And so I think to disregard the importance of prior knowledge is to disregard what we do when we test. But what I think is quite interesting is that certainly in the research that I did on the research into prior knowledge, I couldn't find anything that kind of takes that into account. There is a lot of research out there about the link between prior knowledge and performance. But very little of it takes into account summative testing. So I think, if we've got any educational researchers in the audience who need an idea for their next research project, I think looking at summative testing as a test of prior knowledge is the way to go, because I think that's going to be a good way to see the efficacy of using prior knowledge as a hook for what comes next. I kind of want to shift a little bit now to talk about cognitive load, which we know is a buzzword in education at the moment. I've done a whole show on cognitive load. Please do go back through the archives and check that out if you haven't done so already. But I want to think about the link between prior knowledge and cognitive load, because we know, or we're being told at the moment, It's the big thing in education right now, that reducing cognitive load is the best way to get children to retain things. Making sure that the children don't have too much going on in their head is the easiest way to get them to take on this new information. And, there are all kinds of ways that we are seeing that being put into practice at the moment. We are seeing worksheets with no pictures on. We are seeing schools with no displays in them. We are seeing jotters being used to write down everything so that a child doesn't have to retain it and can then go back and relook at their information. There are all kinds of ways to reduce cognitive load. And I think at the moment, as teachers, we are still experimenting to see what is the best way to do it. But the link between cognitive load and prior learning is something that, quite frankly, I'd never thought about before I started kind of researching for this show. But actually, it makes a whole lot of sense. So the research into the short-term memory shows us that cognitive load affects learning. There's this combination of intrinsic load, so what the student is actively processing within them, and extrinsic load, other things that they are processing around them, which can overburden the mind and make learning difficult and occasionally impossible. And so that means that novices, people who are new to our subject, quite often incur a high cognitive load when they are trying to problem solve. And there are certain strategies that we can put into place in order to reduce that cognitive load. Like I said, I've done a whole show specifically about this. So if this is a new concept to you, please do go back, check out that show, and hopefully I will have enlightened you about cognitive load a little bit. Cognitive load theory is predominantly applied to instructional materials. So, when I started writing textbooks, when I started writing long distance courses, I did a lot of research into cognitive load, because obviously I want the information to be the most important thing. But the importance then of prior learning and the storage of long-term memory of important conceptual frameworks or models is another way to see it. Because cognitive load theory tells us that when we acquire new knowledge, novel information is processed in the working memory, and our working memory has a very limited capacity. New cognitive schemata are constructed in the long-term memory. So this is also where executive function theory comes into play. So we've got a lot of intertwining between these different theories. But essentially what we're saying is, when you are learning something new, the new information is processed in your working memory, in your short-term memory, and that is limited. And I think particularly as we get older, we become very aware of how limited our short-term memory is. Whilst the new cognitive schemata, the new ideas, are constructed, are made in your long-term memory. Your cognitive load, if you have got cognitive overload, then your engagement can be negatively influenced, which means that you are not holding as much in your working memory, in your short-term memory, which means that you don't have as much transferred into your long-term memory. And again, we know that transfer from short to long-term memory is important. We know that curve of forgetting is important. I think it was this time last year I asked on Twitter whether the curve of forgetting is taken into account when timetables are produced. And it doesn't seem to be. And this is a little rant, a little bugbear here. This is something that frustrates me in schools, is that we have got all of this research. We have got all of this learning. We know all of this stuff about how the brain works. And yet there are all of these barriers that stop us from implementing it. So cognitive load can be separated out into subject characteristics, task characteristics, and subject-task interactions. And that's a distinction made by Pass in 1994. So prior knowledge is considered to be a subject characteristic. And students with more prior knowledge may have more working memory capacity available to process their current learning, according to research by Mihalka. And again, this kind of makes sense. So if we're buying into cognitive load theory and we're buying into this idea that new information is stored in the short-term memory, which then has to make that transfer into the long-term memory, if you already know something about the task that you are doing, you don't have to hold that in your short-term memory because it's already in your long-term memory. So you've got more space in your short-term memory to hold new information. You can hold more information because you already know things. This is why literacy is so important. This is why literacy is so important, because a lot of what we give children is written. Worksheets are written, instructions are often written, exams are written. And so if a child can read fluently and isn't having to decode when they are sitting at a worksheet, when they are sitting an exam, then that's one less thing in their working memory so they can retain more. That's obviously this whole theory at a very basic level. But I think it exemplifies quite well why this prior knowledge is important. Because of course, if a student is sitting with their sociology homework and they can't read the instructions, then they're going to have to look over those instructions. They're going to have to spend time. They're going to have to spend cognitive effort deciphering what is on that page before they can even think about retaining that new information. So according to schema theory, prior knowledge is this critical factor in forming a new cognitive schema to gain new knowledge. The prior knowledge decreases cognitive load, which leads to good learning engagement. You can engage better with a lower cognitive load because you are not feeling so stressed about all of the work that's in front of you. Students with lower prior knowledge, this is according to Myhill and Brackley in 2004, and Van Riesen and their colleagues in 2019. Students with lower prior knowledge need more help to decrease that cognitive load, whereas those with higher prior knowledge are more easily able to form the new schema and they perceive a lower cognitive load. This is also why cultural capital is important. This is also why those experiences outside of the classroom are important, because like I talked about at the top of the show, that helps to improve prior knowledge. This is why general knowledge is really important, because that helps to improve prior knowledge. It's why reading for pleasure is important, because that helps to improve prior knowledge. All of these things that we kind of bang on about as being important are for this exact reason. They're not just important for their single subject domain. Reading for pleasure isn't just important for English teachers. It's important across the board because it will reduce that cognitive load when students come to reading their worksheets. Again, in my subject, in languages, we see this in action all the time, particularly when we teach languages that have non-Roman alphabets. So, when I teach Japanese, when I teach Mandarin, when I teach Greek, when I teach Hebrew, I see that cognitive load in play because particularly when they are starting, the children are not just having to learn the vocabulary, but they're having to decode what each of the individual letters represents, what sound each of the individual symbols stands for. And that adds to the cognitive load. It's why people will always say, oh, Chinese must be really hard. Because even if you don't know cognitive load theory, you understand that there is that extra barrier between you and the processing, because you look at a symbol and until you've learnt how it sounds, you don't see how it sounds. And I think that's really important. And I think that, again, we should be giving so much thanks to our foundation stage, key stage 1 colleagues who put those reading skills in motion to make the lives of us up the school so much easier, because we then don't have to worry about students decoding unless we're teaching a language with a different alphabet. Now, cognitive load, interestingly, has a negative relationship with self-regulated learning, as reported by Hughes and their colleagues in 2018. Because cognitive load and self-regulated learning use up a student's cognitive resource. Okay, we kind of have to think about our brains as a computer. You know, we can use that analogy. The more tabs you have open in your browser, the slower the browser is, the quicker it will be to shut down. I think we've all seen the meme that is like, my brain is Google Chrome open with 57 tabs and I can't close any of them, and this one stopped working and there's music playing in the background. And we see that and we go, yeah, that's me, and we chuckle. But actually, that's quite an apt way of thinking of how our brains process, particularly our short-term memory, particularly our working memory. So if you have got that, if your working memory is having to hold on to all kinds of brand new concepts, then you are going to feel overwhelmed. You're going to feel like the stuff that you are learning is difficult, is too hard for you. And so you are more likely to give up. So actually, whilst we may sometimes shy away from engaging prior knowledge because we don't want to bore our students by going back over stuff that they've learned before, reactivating prior knowledge can be helpful in as much as it reduces that cognitive load and so makes them more engaged because they are more able to retain this new stuff. This kind of feeds into what Gailey and their colleagues talked about in 2012, where, excuse me, where they reported that high cognitive load leads to students choosing proxies for learning, superficial learning strategies, things that make it look like they're working, but they're not actually taking anything in. And we've all seen students doing that, where they're filling in the worksheet quite busily. They look very busy, they look very happy, but they're not actually processing the information. They are just doing the worksheet because we've asked them to, rather than because they want to engage with the learning. So if we reduce the cognitive load by activating that prior knowledge, by reminding them of what they already know, they are more likely to actually engage with the work because they have got the mental capacity, they have got the mental processes available to do that. Mihalka and their colleagues in 2011 came with this assumption that students who have a higher level of prior knowledge then have more working memory available to identify their current state of learning and their academic needs, and so they are better able to choose their own learning strategy. Now, metacognition is also a big buzzword at the moment, getting our students to think about their learning, getting our students to take responsibility for their learning. But realistically, how can they do that if they don't know what they already know? How can our students recognize what they are struggling with, recognize what they need to do to improve, if we're not being explicit, if we're not reminding them of what we've already taught them, of what is stored in their long-term memory? Because I've done it before. Again, I've done it with, let's think of an example. Year 7 French. Year 7 French. Places in town. So I did places in town with my year 7s very, very early on. We looked at Paris. We did a bit of a walking tour of Paris using Google Maps, and I pointed out lots of the different shops, just to get them used to the sounds and to get them used to how French phonics work, and to get them used to Paris. Then I came back to places in town a few months later as like an actual topic. And I said, I started with an elicitation exercise. I said, right, who can tell me some different places in town? And my class started to flick through their booklets. And one of them said to me, we haven't got a book for places in town. I don't think we've done it. And I then had to say to them, well, yes, we have. Do you remember? Because I showed you Paris on the board and we had a walk round. And as soon as I reminded them of that, they began to name some of them. Not many, and I didn't expect them to name many. They could remember things like café and hotel, the ones that were cognates. So by kind of reminding them that we had already looked at some of them, and they had done quite well when we had played our game, so that I could assess at the end of that lesson how well they had learnt them. They did very, very well, but they needed reminding that they knew that. And once they had been reminded of the ones that they already knew, they were then better able to access the new vocabulary that I was giving them, or the ones that they had forgotten, because their cognitive load was decreased. They knew that they already knew some of it. They were starting to remember the ones that I had shown them. They remembered when I showed them a Carrefour, but they then knew that they'd forgotten the word for supermarket. And so they were able to identify what they needed to do to improve. Because again, if you don't know what you know, and you don't know what you don't know, how are you supposed to take responsibility for your own learning? So prior knowledge influences the efficacy of help with different cognitive loads. Help provided by instructional support, by teaching, is most effective under conditions of low cognitive load, if we are applying cognitive load theory, and with high prior knowledge. But if you've got high cognitive load and low prior knowledge, then it is less effective, according to research by Seufert and their colleagues in 2007. So your ideal learning scenario is going to be high prior knowledge. They come into your classroom knowing lots already. And remember, that doesn't necessarily need to be lots about the topic that you are studying, because prior knowledge comes from all over. As we've talked about, when I used history as an example, knowing sequential orders of eras can be helpful, because when you say, right, now we're going to learn about the Victorians, students will know that that comes after the Tudors, so they're more advanced than the Tudors were, but before World War II, so they're not as advanced as their grandparents, their great-grandparents. Okay, and that's one less thing that they have to worry about. It's one less thing that they have to hold in their head. That might sound like common sense. That might sound ridiculous to have to say. But it is these tiny little minutiae of understanding that are important, that helps to reduce that cognitive load. And like I said, this is why cultural capital is so, so important. This is why we need to be, as teachers, giving our students as many experiences as possible. Because that's not just beneficial for our own subject, but it's beneficial for everything. Children coming into our classroom, being able to read well, helps to reduce that cognitive load when we give them a textbook, which helps them to retain that information. Students coming into our classrooms with basic numeracy skills, being able to work out a percentage. When we get to A level, and in MFL, we start teaching about marriage, for example, and we give them the different statistics from different countries. They are able to convert the statistics into something that is more meaningful for them, or is easier to say. It might be easier to say 50% than 1 in 2. And so if they've got that basic numeracy skill, then they can do that. And that reduces their cognitive load because it makes it easier for them to remember. So prior knowledge isn't just about, as it was given to me when I did my initial teacher training, and as I've considered it for a long, long time, it's not about making sure that you don't reteach stuff that the kids have already done. It's not about saving time in your curriculum. It's not about saying, oh, okay, well, they've already studied states of matter, so that means that we don't have to do it again. It's about making your lesson, making your new information easier for them to access because they already have something on which to build. No, that was the wrong one. I am sorry.
This show is brought to you in partnership with John Catt Educational, publishers of professional development books and resources that support great teaching and learning in schools around the world. Don't miss out. Level up your professional development today and visit johncattbookshop.com to explore the full range of titles. Use the code JCTTR2425 for 20% off your order. Happy reading. Introducing My New Term, the revolutionary technology application connecting schools and candidates directly. Whether you're a school seeking to streamline your recruitment process or a candidate searching for your next role in education, My New Term has the solution. Developed by a former teacher, the technology at My New Term now connects tens of thousands of candidates with schools every month by digitizing the recruitment process. As a candidate, you can search for jobs, set up recommended jobs, and save time by applying directly to schools via a standardized online process. No more completing manual and repetitive application forms. Employers can streamline processes and save time utilizing the leading applicant tracking system for schools and multi-academy trusts. Recruitment in education has been broken for too long. My New Term is on a mission to change just that. Visit mynewterm.com to learn more, search all the latest opportunities, or schedule a demo. My New Term, shaping the future of education recruitment.
Hi everyone, it's Tom here from Teachers Talk Radio, just dropping by to tell you about our annual history teaching extravaganza, Teachers Talk History, which is coming at you live in Manchester on the 21st of September. The tickets are completely free for classroom teachers, amazing speakers, brilliant contributors, and a fantastic opportunity to network with fellow professionals. Grab your free ticket today at ttradio.org/events, and we will see you there.
So, because I've got a little bit of time, and because I've mentioned it quite a lot this morning, I do just want to spend a couple of minutes before we finish today talking about cultural capital, because it is so important when it comes to activating that prior learning. Now, I'm name dropping so many of my old shows today, which is better than I usually do. I did do a whole show on cultural capital in association with Pearson last summer. So it's a good one. I had lots of really interesting guests on that show from Pearson, and from the wider teaching community, talking about cultural capital, talking about the importance. It was in the domain of MFL, but I think it does more widely apply. So please go back through the archives and find that one if you are interested in the concept. But cultural capital, in case you're not sure, in case you have forgotten, is this sociological concept put forward by the theorist Bourdieu that comprises your own social assets. So when we talk about capital, we often think about money. When we talk about capitalism, we think about how much money somebody has in order to start a business, or how much money businesses feel they need to take. And money is one of the types of capital, economic capital, but so is cultural capital. So when Bourdieu talked about capital, what he was saying is anything that you have, material, spiritual, intellectual, social, anything that you have is your capital. And he talked about this cultural capital that looks at your education, your intellect, your style of speech, your style of dress, the people you socialize with, the opportunities that you have, all of which promote social mobility in a stratified society like ours. So Bourdieu asserted that the higher your cultural capital, the more likely you were to be able to move up through the social classes, because you had more access to stuff, to culture, and to people. So cultural capital is a social relationship. So it's about the people that you know who can provide opportunities. But it is also an economic and business relationship, because it's about the type of things to which you have access. So I live in a small town here in Gloucestershire. My nearest museum is 5 miles away. And I'm very, very grateful that my nearest museum is that close. But it wasn't open when I was a child. It's a relatively new museum. So when I was a kid, the only time I got to go to museums was when my parents would take me when we went to London. So, luckily my parents were always big on learning. So we did like museums and castles and all that good stuff quite regularly. But we would have to travel all the way to London, which is a couple of 100 miles from here, to go to the Natural History Museum, to go to the British Museum, to go to the V&A, whatever it might have been. Because that sort of thing isn't readily available on my doorstep. And I was very lucky that my parents made the effort to do that with us, that my parents wanted to do that with us, that my parents had the time and the money to be able to afford to take us to London. Because, petrol's not cheap. Museum entry may be free, but when you're taking kids to a museum, you know that you've got to swing by the gift shop. So that's going to be at least, £20 probably these days on rulers and pencils and rubbers. But that kind of made up our cultural capital. And I think even as a child, I was aware of how that benefited me in school, because when we started to learn about the Egyptians, for example, in year 3, I had already seen a mummy in a museum. So when we learned about the mummies, I could already picture what it looked like. Whereas some of my friends in class whose parents didn't take them to museums, they couldn't picture it. They had to look over the pictures in the book and kind of try and retain that information from there. So I could already be one step ahead. I'm very lucky in that my parents always promoted my enjoyment of reading. Ever since I was little, I've had books. And, there is part of it is down to me and the fact that I like books. And then part of it is down to the fact that books were readily available to me as a child. The library in my town, before it moved to a new building very recently, was literally 2 minutes door to door. So the library was one of the very first places I was allowed to go on my own as a child, so that I could take my books back and get new ones out. And it's just those little things that happen outside of school, which then make learning in school easier. With the books, I remember vividly, again, actually from a trip to a museum, I got an ancient Egypt pop-up book. I loved that book. I loved pop-up books. You don't see them very often anymore. I think they should make a resurgence. And I don't remember very much now about the book, but I remember the center fold of the book being a pyramid. And so, opening it up, and the pyramid came. And so again, I remember learning about pyramids in year 3. And the fact that I already knew that a pyramid was a 3D triangle, because I'd seen it in my pop-up book. I knew that it was made of bricks, because that had been in the detail in the pop-up pyramid in my book. I knew that, as we were taught back then, it was made by the slaves who are mentioned in the Bible, because that was just kind of what we were taught. I already knew that because of my pop-up book. It was there. I remember the little picture of the man bringing the bricks across on a sled thing. And I already knew all of that. So because I already knew that, I had the space in my working memory to take on board the new stuff that my teacher was teaching me. And capital is a privilege. And I think quite often when we think about our differentiation in class, we often don't take cultural capital into account. We don't take into account the families who can't afford to have books in the home. So the children can't just flick through and learn things anymore. Even on a wider scale, we don't take into account the fact that when we were young, we probably had encyclopedias in the house. I had a 2-volume encyclopedia, A to J in one, and then the rest of the letters in the other, that I used to just flick through. Because when I was little, if there was nothing on TV and your friends didn't want to go out and play, then there was nothing else to do. So I flicked through the encyclopedia, and I picked up a lot. But it's very unlikely that there's an encyclopedia in the house these days. In fact, I don't think I have an encyclopedia in my house these days, because online searching is so easy. But unless you kind of fall down a Wikipedia rabbit hole, you are unlikely to spend time reading through articles, because there are other things to do. And I think in terms of cultural capital, we forget that these days, that because children are so easily entertained now, they do spend less time just flicking through things, just leafing through magazines, just looking through books, just reading encyclopedias, reading the dictionary, because there is nothing else to do. So I think when we think about cultural capital, it is really important to think about what children under our care have available to them in their wider community, based on what their parents are able to offer, but also what we had as children that don't exist anymore. Because that means that children are not necessarily going to learn in the same way that we did. I think that brings us to the end for today. Thank you very much, as always, for listening. I hope that what is a very kind of common sense topic has been interesting, and I hope that you've been able to take something away from it. Please do stay tuned, because as always, we have a lot of good shows on Teachers Talk Radio over the week, and I will be back with you in my usual studio, so without a ticking clock, next Saturday morning. Have yourselves a great week. Thank you very much, and goodbye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.